My name is Arturo. My son, the one I gave my life for, told me my memories were nothing more than made-up stories from an old man. He said it right there, in the living room I built with my own hands, with his wife smirking beside him as if I were a piece of broken furniture they were about to throw out. That was the moment I understood I was no longer his father. I was just a ghost in my own house, a nuisance who didn't understand their real world. A deep silence fell over me, the kind that screams louder than any insult, because it's the sound of a heart breaking for the last time. It was a wound that I knew would never heal. What would you do in my place? Listen to my story until the end and tell me, what would you have done? Also, let me know from which city in Mexico you're listening. I need to know I'm not alone in this. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. It all happened on a Sunday afternoon, one of those days that are supposed to be for family. The sun was hitting the dusty window of my small house in the Colonia, the same house where my dear Elena and I raised him. David and his wife, Sophia, were visiting, which had become a rare occasion. They sat on the new sofa they insisted on buying me, though I was perfectly fine with my old one. I was in my worn-out armchair, the one that knows all my secrets, and I tried to share something with them. I started telling them about the time I built a series of beautiful cedar bookshelves for a quiet, peculiar client, a story that meant more than they could imagine. But David wasn't listening. His eyes were glued to the little screen in his hand, his thumb scrolling endlessly. His impatience was like a storm cloud, filling the small room, heavy and suffocating. I was just getting to the part about the intricate dovetail joints, the smell of the wood, the pride in the work, when he cut me off. He didn't even look up from his phone. He just let out a long, exaggerated sigh, the kind that's meant to be heard, to sting. "Papa, please," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "No one has time for your made-up stories from the old days. We live in the real world now." Sophia let out a little chuckle, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed his disdain. The words hit me harder than any physical blow ever could. It wasn't just about the story. It was my entire life, my work, my memories, all of it dismissed as worthless fantasy. In that instant, I saw the truth in his eyes. I was invisible to him. My past was a burden, and my presence was an inconvenience. A cold wave washed over me. The warmth of the afternoon sun vanished. I felt my throat tighten, but no words came out. What could I say? How do you defend your own existence to your son? I just looked at him, at this stranger who wore my son's face, and then I looked at his wife, who was now examining her nails as if my pain was the most boring thing in the world. The silence in the room was deafening. The ticking of the old clock on the wall, a gift from my Elena, felt like it was counting down my final moments of dignity. I didn't get angry. I didn't yell. Something inside me just broke. It was the quiet, definitive snap of a bond that had been stretched thin for years. I finally understood that I had lost him long ago. This was just the burial. Slowly, my old bones protesting, I pushed myself up from my armchair. Every movement felt heavy, as if I were wading through mud. I didn't give them another look. I couldn't. I just turned and walked toward my bedroom, each step a confirmation of my new reality, as an outcast in my own home. I could feel their eyes on my back, but there was no, "Papa, wait," or "I'm sorry." There was nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint, tinny sounds from David's phone. As I closed my bedroom door, I leaned against the cool wood and remembered selling my prized collection of antique carpentry tools, tools from my own father, to pay for David's last year of university. Elena and I had celebrated that sacrifice, convinced it was the foundation of a better life for him. How naive we were. We gave him a future, and in return he erased my past. Behind that closed door, the silence was a weight. It pressed down on me, heavy with the ghosts of yesterday. My life wasn't a collection of made-up stories. It was forged in the dust of a small pueblo in Jalisco, a place where a man's worth was measured by the calluses on his hands and the honesty in his eyes. I left that town with nothing but a change of clothes and a set of my father's old carpentry tools in a worn leather satchel. I came to the city not looking for riches, but for a chance to build something that would last. I wanted a life my own father, a man who worked the fields until his back broke, could only dream of. I didn't know then that building a life and building a family were two very different kinds of work, and one was far more fragile than the other. I met my Elena at a neighborhood kermesse, one of those street fairs with music and food and laughter that felt like the whole world was celebrating. She wasn't the flashiest girl there, no. She was quiet, with a smile that could calm a storm and eyes that saw right through the sawdust on my clothes to the man underneath. We courted the old-fashioned way, with walks in the Alameda, with small, shy gifts, a wooden bird I carved for her, a handkerchief she embroidered for me. When we married, we had almost nothing. Our wedding was a simple affair at the local parish. With more love than guests, we moved into a tiny 2-room rental, and our only piece of furniture was a mattress on the floor. But we had a promise. We promised each other we would build our own home, one brick at a time. And we did. Every Sunday, my only day off from the construction sites, I would work on our little plot of land on the edge of the Colonia. I laid the foundation, mixed the cement, and raised the walls with my own hands. Elena would be there beside me, bringing me agua de Jamaica, holding the bricks, her hands getting rough just like mine. She'd say, "Arturo, this house isn't being built with cement, but with our dreams." When David was born, the house was barely finished. There were no proper doors yet, just blankets hanging in the doorways, but he was born in a home that was truly ours. He was our greatest dream made real. I remember holding him for the first time, his tiny hand wrapped around my finger, and I swore to God and to his mother that this child would never know the struggle I did. I worked like a mule to keep that promise. I took every job I could find, from framing houses and new developments to crafting fine furniture for wealthy families in Las Lomas. I'd leave before the sun was up and come home long after it had set, my body aching, my clothes smelling of sweat and wood shavings. But the exhaustion vanished the moment I saw David's face. For his 5th birthday, I remember he wanted a bicycle more than anything. A new one was impossible. It cost more than a week's wages. So I found a rusted frame in a scrapyard, and for a month, I spent my nights in our small patio, sanding, painting, and piecing it together with scavenged parts. The morning of his birthday, when he saw that shiny blue bicycle, his eyes lit up like the whole sky. He didn't see a second-hand bike. He saw magic, Elena cried. That was the payment for my work. Elena was the heart of our home. She was the one who made sure David did his homework, who taught him his prayers, who could stretch a few pesos to feed us for a week. She was the one who believed in my craft, calling me an artist, not just a carpenter. When a client would praise my work, she would beam with more pride than I did. She'd run her hand over a finished piece of furniture, a cedar chest or a dining table, and say, "There's a piece of your soul in this wood, am I amor?" She understood that my work wasn't just about money. It was about creating something beautiful and honest in a world that often felt ugly and crooked. She knew the stories behind each piece, the challenges, the small triumphs. She was my memory keeper. As David grew, we poured everything into his education. We wanted him to have a mind that worked with numbers and words, not just with a hammer and a saw. We sent him to the best public schools we could get him into, buying his uniforms, his books, even when it meant we ate beans and tortillas for a week straight. I remember him struggling with his math homework one night, frustrated to the point of tears. I sat with him, my big, clumsy hands trying to help him understand the strange symbols. I couldn't solve the problems, of course, but I stayed there with him until he figured it out. I just wanted him to know he wasn't alone in his struggle, that his father, even if uneducated, was right there with him, sharing the weight. The biggest sacrifice came when he was accepted into the university. It was a private one, a good one, but the cost was astronomical to us. We used all our savings, but it wasn't enough for his final year. I had a collection of antique tools, passed down from my father and his father before him. German steel, rosewood handles, they were my history, my connection to the man who came before me. Selling them felt like cutting off a limb, but I did it. I took them to a collector downtown and didn't even haggle. I just took the money. That night, I came home with the cash in an envelope and empty hands. Elena held me, and we didn't speak. We both knew what that sacrifice meant. It was for David's future, a future we were building for him out of pieces of our own past. He graduated with honors. We were so proud we felt our hearts would burst. We threw a small party for him in our backyard, with barbacoa and all the neighbors. He wore his cap and gown, and I looked at my son, the engineer, and thought, "We did it, Elena. We did it." He was going to have a different life, a better life. He got a good job in a big company, and soon after, he met Sophia. At first, she seemed nice enough, if a little polished. She came from a family with more money, and she was used to a different kind of life. A life where things came easily, where you didn't have to build your own house or fix your own bicycle. We were happy for him. A father wants his son to have a good partner, to build his own family. But then, the visits started to become less frequent. The phone calls got shorter. When they came over, David seemed different. He would look around our little house, the one built with our own hands, as if he were seeing it for the first time, and not in a good way. He'd point out the crack in the plaster or the old-fashioned tiles in the kitchen. Sophia would just nod, a tight little smile on her face. They started talking about their lives, their trips, their investments, using words I didn't understand. It was like they were speaking a different language, a language of a world I didn't belong to. I felt myself becoming smaller in my own home, my own armchair. Then Elena got sick. It was fast and it was cruel. The cancer ate away at her, but never at her spirit. I took care of her, just as we had taken care of each other our whole lives. I bathed her, I fed her, I held her hand through the long, painful nights. David would visit, but he was always restless, looking at his watch, talking about work commitments. He loved his mother, I know he did, but he didn't know how to be present in the face of such raw, ugly pain. It was a reality his new, clean world had no place for. He brought expensive specialists, which I was grateful for, but what Elena needed was her son's time, not his money. On one of her last good days, she made me promise. We were sitting on the patio, the same place where I'd built David's bike so many years ago. Her voice was a whisper, thin as a thread. "Arturo," she said, her hand clutching mine, "promise me you'll make sure David is secure. But promise me you'll also protect what we built. Our story. Don't let them forget where they came from. Don't let them lose their soul for the sake of things." I promised her. It was a sacred vow, a promise made to the love of my life. A few weeks later, she was gone. The silence she left behind was a wound that would never close. After she died, the distance grew into a chasm. David and Sophia would talk about managing my expenses and simplifying my life. They suggested I sell the house. "It's too big for you, Papa," David said. "Think of the upkeep." They didn't see a home built of dreams. They saw a financial asset, a burden. They didn't understand that every wall, every floorboard, held a memory of Elena. Selling this house would be like burying her all over again. I refused, quietly but firmly. That was the first time I saw the flash of real annoyance in his eyes. It was the look of a son whose inheritance was being inconvenient. The birth of my grandson, Mateo, should have brought us closer. For a little while it did. I would hold him and see a little bit of my David, a little bit of Elena. I started carving him a set of wooden animals, just simple little things. But Sophia was always there, hovering. "Be careful, Don Arturo, he might put that in his mouth. It's probably not sanitary." She said it with a smile, but the words were a wall. They stopped bringing him over as much. They said he was too busy with preschool activities, with playdates. They were raising him in their world, a sterile world where a grandfather's handmade toys were seen as a danger, not a gift of love. I tried to keep the connection. I would save newspaper clippings about engineering projects I thought David might find interesting. I tried to tell him about my day, about a tricky piece of wood I was working on, or a neighbor who needed help. But his attention was always somewhere else, on that little glowing screen in his hand. He'd just nod and say, "That's nice, Papa," without ever hearing a word I said. The man I sat with in my living room was no longer the boy whose eyes lit up at a rebuilt bicycle, or the young man I had sacrificed a piece of my soul for. He was a stranger, a well-dressed, successful stranger, who carried my blood but not my heart. And so my stories became the only thing I had left. They were my way of holding on to Elena, of remembering the man I once was, of trying to bridge the gap to my son. I wasn't telling them to brag or to live in the past. I was telling them to say, "This is who I am. This is where you come from. This is the foundation upon which your easy life was built." I thought that maybe, just maybe, if I told the right story, he would look up from his phone and see me again. See the father who loved him, not the old man who was in his way. I was a fool to believe that. Some gaps are too wide to be bridged by words alone. That Sunday, when he called my memories made-up stories, he wasn't just dismissing a tale about a client. He was taking my entire life. My sweat, my sacrifices, Elena's love, the home we built, the tools I sold, the promise I made, and throwing it all away like trash. He was telling me that none of it mattered. In his real world, my reality had no value. That was the moment I finally understood the depth of my promise to Elena. Protecting what we built wasn't just about the house or the memories. It was about protecting the dignity of a life lived with honor, even if the person who benefited most from it could no longer see it. My son didn't know me, but I knew myself, and I knew what I had to do. The betrayal didn't arrive like a sudden clap of thunder. No, it was more like a slow, creeping fog, the kind that settles in overnight and by morning you can't see the path in front of you. It began subtly, right after David married Sophia. Before, he would just drop by after work, his shirt still dusty, and would sit in the yard with a cold beer and talk about nothing and everything. After her, the visits became scheduled events. "Papa, we can come by on Sunday at 2, he'd say on the phone. It was no longer a son visiting his father. It was an appointment, a duty to be fulfilled. The easy laughter was replaced by a polite, strained silence that felt heavier than any argument. Sophia was the architect of this new distance, a master of building walls with a smile. She never said a cruel word directly to me. Instead, her disapproval was in her little glances, her sighs. She'd run a finger over a piece of furniture Elena had cherished, and say, "Oh, David, this is so traditional." Or she'd look at the tiles in our kitchen, the ones Elena and I picked out together at the market, and say, "A modern backsplash would really open up the space." She wasn't just redecorating a house in her mind. She was erasing a history she felt no connection to, chipping away at the foundation of my life, one helpful suggestion at a time, making me feel like a relic in my own museum. The first real blow came on the anniversary of Elena's passing. For the first few years, David and I had a tradition. We would go to the cemetery together, leave her favorite flowers, and then share a quiet meal at a small restaurant she loved. That year, the 5th year, he called me in the morning. "Papa, I'm so sorry. Sophia and I have this work dinner we just can't get out of. It's for a client. You understand." I told him I understood, but my voice felt hollow. That evening, I went to the cemetery alone. I sat by her grave for hours, talking to her as the sun went down, feeling the emptiness of the chair beside me. I knew, deep down, it wasn't a client dinner. It was the beginning of being forgotten. When my grandson, Matteo, was born, a spark of hope ignited in my chest. I thought, here he is, the bridge, the blood that connects us all. I remember holding him for the first time in the hospital, this tiny, perfect being. I looked at David, and for a moment, I saw my son again, the young man full of dreams, not the tense stranger he had become. I started carving a set of little wooden animals for Matteo, a donkey, a rooster, a little coyote, just like the ones my own father had made for me. I imagined him playing with them on the floor of the living room, filling the house with a child's laughter again. It was a beautiful dream, but it was just that, a dream. That dream began to crumble under the weight of Sophia's anxieties. The first time I showed her the little carved donkey, she smiled a tight plastic smile. "Oh, Don Arturo, that's rustic, but is the wood treated? He puts everything in his mouth, you know." The toys were deemed a choking hazard, unsanitary, too old-fashioned. They were quietly put away in a box, never to be seen again. The visits with Matteo became shorter and more supervised. "He has a very busy schedule," Sophia would explain. "He has early learning classes, play dates. They were building a world for him that had no room for a grandfather with sawdust on his hands and simple handmade gifts." I remember one Christmas Eve we spent at their new, sterile house in a gated community. The table was set for 10 people, all of them Sophia's friends or colleagues. I sat at the end, a stranger at the feast. The conversation buzzed around me, a language of stock portfolios, European vacations, and names of people I'd never meet. David, caught up in playing the perfect host, would occasionally glance my way and give a quick, empty smile. I ate in silence, the food tasteless in my mouth. I was there, but I wasn't. I was a ghost at their table, a family obligation they had to display once a year before putting me back in the closet until the next holiday. The phone calls changed, too. They stopped being about sharing our lives and started being about managing mine. It was no longer, "How are you, Papa?" but, "Did you remember to take your pills? Have you paid the water bill? We're worried you'll fall." Every question, dripping with false concern, was an insinuation that I was incompetent, that I was a child who needed looking after. They weren't calling to connect with me. They were calling to check on their future problem, to make sure the old man hadn't burned the house down or forgotten to lock the door. The calls left me feeling more alone than the silence did. For my 75th birthday, I secretly hoped they would surprise me. Maybe a small dinner, just the three of us, like old times. I waited all day. Around noon, a motorcycle courier knocked on my door. He handed me a fancy envelope. Inside was a gift card to a big, impersonal department store, and a birthday card with a printed message. Below it, 2 hurried signatures, David and Sophia. I stared at that plastic card, a substitute for their presence, a transaction instead of an embrace. I put it in a drawer and never used it. I would rather have their time than their money, but their time was a currency I could no longer afford. Their helpful suggestions became more frequent and more insistent. "Papa, this old armchair is a safety hazard. What if you trip?" Sophia would say, eyeing the very chair Elena and I bought together when we were first married. "We should hire a service to come and clean out all this clutter," David would add, gesturing to my tools, my books, the small mementos of a lifetime. They saw clutter. I saw my life. Every object they wanted to throw away held a piece of my story, a memory of my Elena. Their desire to simplify my life was a desire to erase it, to sanitize my past, to make their present more comfortable. A profound loneliness began to set in, the kind that comes from not being understood. I would see something in the neighborhood, a beautifully crafted old door, a tree that was dying, and I'd think of telling David, but then I'd stop myself. What was the point? He was fluent in the language of apps and quarterly reports now. He no longer spoke the language of wood grain, of neighborhood news, of the simple, tangible world I lived in. We existed in the same city, but we lived in different centuries. The distance between us was no longer measured in kilometers, but in values. One Saturday, they arrived unannounced, armed with boxes and trash bags. "We're here to help you declutter, Papa," Sophia announced cheerfully. Before I could protest, she was in my bedroom, pulling out a box of Elena's things. It held her old letters, the dried flowers from our wedding, a small embroidered handkerchief. "We can just get rid of all this old paper, right?" she asked, not really asking. I felt a cold rage rise in my chest. I snatched the box from her hands. "Leave it," I said, my voice low and shaking. "Leave her things alone." They looked at me as if I were a madman, clutching my worthless treasures. They didn't see memories. They saw trash. I started to watch my son, really watch him, during their visits. I noticed he rarely made eye contact with me anymore. His gaze would drift over my shoulder, toward the television, or down to his phone. When I spoke, he would nod, but his eyes were vacant. He was a puppet, and Sophia was pulling the strings. He deferred to her on everything, from what they should have for dinner to what was best for me. The strong, confident boy I had raised had been replaced by this shell of a man, so desperate for his wife's approval that he was willing to discard his own father to get it. He had traded his roots for a beautifully decorated cage. A memory hit me so hard one day it nearly buckled my knees. David was about 7, and he had a terrible fever. For 2 nights, Elena and I took turns holding him, bathing his forehead with cool cloths, whispering stories to him. We were a team, a fortress against the illness. We were united in our love and our fear for him. I remembered the feeling of his small, hot hand in mine, the absolute trust in his eyes. I looked across my quiet living room, at the empty space where Elena used to sit, and the contrast between that memory and my current reality was a physical pain, a sharp, stabbing grief for a family that no longer existed. The most painful blow came from my own grandson. On one of their rare visits, Mateo, who was about 5 then, was running around the living room. He stopped in front of me, wrinkled his nose, and said, "Abuelo, Papa says your stories are boring and they make him sleepy." He said it with the complete innocence of a child, simply repeating the truth he had learned from his parents. David went pale and quickly tried to shush him, but the words were already out, hanging in the air like poison. My stories. The only bridge I had left to connect with them and my own son was teaching his child that it was a bridge to nowhere, a boring waste of time. After that, their questions became more practical, more morbid. "Papa, we need to talk about your affairs," David said one afternoon, his voice businesslike. "Do you have a will? Is the house in your name? We need to have these things in order for when you know." He couldn't even say the words. He wasn't worried about my peace of mind. He was worried about the paperwork. They were vultures, circling, waiting for me to be gone so they could pick the bones of the life I had built. They wanted the house, the asset, without the inconvenient old man who came with it. I became truly invisible. I would sit in my armchair, the one they hated so much, and listen to them talk about their plans right in front of me. They'd discuss renovating the house after I was gone. We could knock down this wall, Sophia would muse, and create an open-concept living space. They spoke as if I were already a ghost, a faint memory in a house that was already theirs in their minds. The humiliation was absolute. To be alive, to be breathing in your own home, and to be treated as if you are already dead is a cruelty that has no name. My last foolish attempt at connection was for Mateo's 6th birthday. I spent a month in my workshop, carving him a detailed replica of a small fishing boat, with tiny sails and a rudder that actually worked. It was the finest thing I had made in years. When I presented it to them, David looked uncomfortable. Sophia took it and smiled that same cold smile. "Oh, how lovely. It's a beautiful model. I'll put it on a high shelf in his room where it will be safe." Safe. She meant it would never be touched, never be played with, never be loved. It was just another piece of clutter from the old man, destined to gather dust until it could be thrown away. And that was it. That was the moment the fog finally cleared, and I saw the stark, ugly truth. It wasn't one single event. It was 1,000 tiny cuts, a slow and steady erosion of love and respect. Each missed call, each condescending suggestion, each ignored story had been a shovelful of dirt they were using to bury me while I was still alive. So when that Sunday afternoon arrived, and David dismissed my life as made-up stories, it wasn't a surprise. It was simply the final nail in a coffin they had been building for years. I finally understood my place. I was not their family, I was their burden. And a burden is something you eventually set down. Back in my room, the silence was no longer heavy with pain. It was sharp, clear. A cold clarity had settled over me, the kind that comes after a fever breaks. Through the thin walls, I could hear the murmur of their voices from the living room, the occasional sharp laugh from Sophia. They were probably discussing what to do with me, the old man and his inconvenient memories. They saw a frail, defeated figure who had shuffled away from them. They saw liability. They had no idea who I really was. They didn't know the man Elena had married, the man who knew that the quietest people often have the loudest secrets. They had underestimated me my entire life, but never more so than in that moment. I knelt, my old knees cracking in protest, and pulled a simple wooden box from under my bed. It wasn't fancy, just a plain cedar box I had made decades ago to hold our most important papers. It smelled of age and secrets. Inside, beneath our marriage certificate and Elena's baptismal record, was a thick folder. The papers inside were old, the ink faded, but they represented a story David had dismissed as make-believe. The story of the cedar bookshelves. The client, a reclusive and intensely private man named Don Julian Robles, hadn't just been a client. He had been a turning point, a silent fork in the road of my life that my son had never known existed. Don Julian lived in an old hacienda on what was then the dusty outskirts of the city. He was a man of few words but sharp eyes. He hired me to build a library for his vast collection of books. For 6 months, I worked in his quiet home. He would watch me for hours, not speaking, just observing my hands, the way I measured twice, the care I took with each joint. He saw that I used the best wood, even for the parts no one would see. He saw that I never rounded up my hours. He saw honesty in my craft, a quality he said was rarer than gold. We developed a strange friendship, a bond built on the shared appreciation of things made to last. One day, as the project was nearing its end, Don Julian called me into his study. He told me he had no family, no children to leave his legacy to. He had spent his life turning money into more money, but he respected men who turned labor into something real. He told me he was buying huge tracts of land far beyond his hacienda, land everyone thought was worthless scrubland. "They see dirt, Arturo," he said. "I see the future." He then made me an offer. He offered me a partnership in a small section of that land, a 5-hectare plot. He would sell it to me for a symbolic price, a sum that was, for us, still the entirety of our life's savings. That night, I told Elena. I laid out the maps Don Julian had given me on our small kitchen table. It was all the money we had in the world. It was a gamble on a strange old man's word. Elena looked at the papers, then she looked at me. She didn't hesitate for a second. "An honest man recognizes another, Arturo," she said. "This is not a gamble. It is a reward for your character. We took all our savings, every last peso we had hidden away for an emergency or a hardship, and we gave it to Don Julian. We signed the papers, and he gave me a firm handshake. "Let this sleep," he advised. "One day it will wake up and change everything." We decided then and there never to tell David. Not until we were gone. It wasn't about hiding wealth from him. It was about building character in him. We had seen what unearned money did to the children of the rich families I sometimes worked for. It made them soft, arrogant, and ungrateful. We wanted our son to know the pride of earning his own way, of building his own life with his own two hands, just as we had. The land was our secret, a safety net for the distant future. But his education, his work ethic, his integrity, that was to be his real inheritance. It was a lesson we were trying to teach him, a final gift. For 30 years, the secret slept. Don Julian passed away a decade after our deal, his vast estate managed by a faceless firm in Mexico City. Our papers, locked in the cedar box, were the only proof of our small claim. Life went on. I continued to work with my hands. We raised David. We paid for his university. We mourned Elena. The land was just a ghost, a story Elena and I would sometimes whisper about late at night. It was so far from our reality as a working-class family that it felt like a dream. David grew up, got his fancy job, his fancy wife, and saw us only as a simple carpenter and his homemaker wife, living on a modest pension. Then, about 3 years ago, the city, which had been creeping outward for years, suddenly roared to life in that direction. A new industrial corridor was announced. A major highway, connecting to the north, was built right past the old hacienda. The worthless scrubland became the new frontier for warehouses, factories, and exclusive residential developments. The sleeping giant Don Julian had spoken of had finally awoken. One morning, a letter arrived, not in a plain envelope, but a thick, formal one from a real estate consortium. They wanted to know if the owner of Parcel 7B was interested in selling. I didn't understand the numbers they were talking about. They seemed like a misprint, a joke. The offer was for millions. I took the letter and the papers from my cedar box to a small, discreet lawyer my parish priest had recommended, a serious man named Licenciado Vargas. I was nervous, feeling like an imposter. I was just Arturo, the carpenter. What did I know of such things? Licenciado Vargas took a week. He made calls, checked municipal records, and verified the deed. When I returned to his office, he looked at me with a new kind of respect. He sat me down and explained it to me in simple terms. The land, my 5-hectare share of Don Julian's foresight, was now prime commercial real estate. My little piece of dirt was sitting directly where a new shopping center was planned. He showed me the official valuation. Conservatively, he said, my land was worth 22 million pesos. 22 million! The number just hung in the air. Unreal. I thought of all the years I had patched my work boots to make them last another month. I thought of Elena saving pesos in a jar for David's school books. The weight of that number was so immense, it was almost comical. A strange, bitter feeling washed over me. I thought of David and Sophia in my living room, sighing about the cost of a new water heater for me. I thought of them seeing me as a financial burden, a poor old man who couldn't even manage his own small expenses. They were so busy with their important lives, calculating their stock options and planning their next vacation, and all the while, their poor old papa was sitting on a fortune that could buy and sell their entire world. They saw an old man losing his memories, but they were the ones who were blind, deaf, and dumb to the truth. The most painful irony of all was that the key to this entire secret, the origin of this life-changing wealth, was contained in the very story David had so cruelly dismissed. The story about the cedar bookshelves for Don Julian wasn't a made-up story from the old days. It was the single most important financial story of his life, the foundation of a security he couldn't even imagine, and he had covered his ears and rolled his eyes. He had mocked the very memory that held the key to his future. He didn't just disrespect his father, he disrespected his own fortune, his own history. I remembered Elena's dying words, her hand frail in mine. Protect what we built, Arturo. Don't let them lose their soul for the sake of things. In that moment, sitting in the lawyer's dusty office, I finally understood the true depth of her wisdom. Giving this money to David now would not be a gift. It would be a curse. It would reward his arrogance, validate Sophia's materialism, and utterly destroy any chance he had of finding the soul Elena so desperately wanted him to keep. The secret was never about the money. It was a test of character, and my son, my only son, had failed. Suddenly, I was no longer the victim. The humiliation I had felt in the living room evaporated, replaced by a quiet, solid strength. I was not the weak, dependent old man they saw. I was the keeper of the secret, the architect of our family's true foundation. They thought they held all the cards, with their youth, their money, their modern world. But I held a deed, I held a pen, I held a story. The real one, and I would be the one to write its final chapter. A profound sense of calm settled over me. There was no anger, no need for vengeance. There was only a duty to be done. I looked at Licenciado Vargas, whose face was a mask of professional neutrality, but whose eyes held a flicker of understanding. I was no longer a confused old man in his office. I was his most important client. I felt the weight of 82 years on my shoulders, but it was not a burden. It was a fortress of experience. They had called my memories worthless, but my memory was my greatest asset. It held the truth, and the truth, as Don Julian had known, was the only thing that was truly built to last. I straightened my back, feeling a dignity I hadn't felt in years. The plan formed in my mind, not born of anger, but of a sad, resolute love. A love for the woman who had trusted me, for the life we had built, and even a tragic love for the son I had lost. It would not be a loud, messy fight. There would be no yelling, no recriminations. It would be silent, it would be strategic, it would be just. I looked at the lawyer and said, my voice steady and clear, for the first time in a long time, Licenciado, I need you to draw up a new will for me. We have a lot of work to do. My plan wasn't born from a desire for revenge. Vengeance is a hot, messy fire that consumes everything, even the person who starts it. No, my plan was cold, quiet, and built with the same precision I used to build Don Julian's library. It was about balance. It was about honoring my promise to Elena. I sat across from Licenciado Vargas and laid it out, piece by piece. The first step was to sell the house. This house, the one they saw as their future inheritance, the one Sophia was already redecorating in her mind, would be sold. The money from the sale, along with the entire 22 million pesos from Don Julian's land, would be placed into a trust. I was not just closing a door on my son. I was building a new one, a much larger one for others. My hands, which they saw as old and useless, were about to build one last great thing. The heart of my new will, the new legacy of Arturo the Carpenter, would be a foundation. I told the lawyer to name it La Fundación Elena Rivera de Oficios, the Elena Rivera Foundation for the Trades. All the money, every last peso, would go to creating scholarships for young men and women who wanted to learn a real skill. Carpentry, masonry, plumbing, welding, the very jobs that built this country, but that people like my son now look down upon. It would give them money for tools, for apprenticeships, for starting their own small businesses. My life's work, and the silent reward it brought, would not furnish a fancy house for Sophia, or pay for David's expensive vacations. It would build futures for hundreds of kids who knew the value of sweat and callous hands. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever designed. For my grandson Mateo, I set aside a small trust, not a fortune, but enough, 100,000 pesos, to be given to him only when he turned 25. But there were conditions. He could only access the money to continue his education, or to start a business that involved a tangible skill, something he created with his own hands or mind, not just a scheme to make money from money. I wanted him to have a chance to know the pride that his father had forgotten. And for David? For my son, the engineer, the man who lived in the real world, I left him 10,000 pesos, enough to pay for a nice dinner maybe. Along with it, I left a single, sealed letter. In it, I did not scold him. I simply told him the story of the cedar bookshelves one last time, the real story, so he would finally understand that the inheritance he lost wasn't money, but the respect he never gave. The hardest and most liberating step was selling the house. The agent, a friend of Licenciado Vargas, was quiet and efficient. Within a month, a young family bought it, a doctor and his wife with 2 small children. I watched them walk through the rooms, their eyes full of dreams, and I saw myself and Elena all those years ago. They saw a home, not an asset. They wanted to know the story of the house, and I told them. When I signed the final papers, a weight I didn't even know I was carrying lifted from my shoulders. I took only my clothes, my tools, my armchair, and the cedar box with Elena's things. I walked out the front door for the last time, not looking back. I was no longer a ghost in my own house. I was a free man. I live now in a small, clean apartment in a quiet part of Querétaro, a city I always loved. It has a balcony that gets the morning sun, where I can sit in my old armchair and drink my coffee. I have my workshop set up in the spare room, and I spend my days carving small wooden birds, not for money, but for the joy of it. I don't know when my son will find out. When the letter from the lawyer arrives, their world will be turned upside down. There will be anger, confusion, disbelief. But I won't be there to hear it. My justice was not in their punishment, but in my peace. They thought my stories were worthless, but in the end, my story was the only thing of value. And I made sure it had an ending worthy of the life I lived and the woman I loved. I finally protected what we built.